The jungle was quiet that morning, too quiet for war. The sound of insects filled the air, broken only by the distant echo of boots crunching through dirt. Inside the barbed wire fences of Camp O'Donnell, hundreds of POWs stirred weakly, unsure if the gunfire had finally stopped or if it was only moving closer. Shadows in uniform. For 3 years they had survived on handfuls of rice, dirty water, and hope. Their uniforms were rags, their faces hollow. When the guards suddenly disappeared that morning, the silence was more frightening than gunfire. The gates creak open. Just after dawn, a distant rumble echoed. Tanks, trucks, engines. Then a voice. Not Japanese. "Hold fire. They're ours," someone screamed. And just like that, the war, for them, was over. American troops entered the camp cautiously. The smell of sickness hit first. Then came the sight. Skeleton-like men crawling from huts, blinking at the sunlight like they had forgotten what it was. One soldier whispered, "Dear God, what did they do to them?" The faces of freedom. One POW, Lieutenant Andrews, fell to his knees as he saw the American flag patch on a soldier's arm. He tried to salute, but couldn't lift his hand. The soldier saluted him instead, the cry of relief. When the first medic said, "You're safe now," men began to weep. Some laughed, some collapsed. Years of pain broke like a dam. The jungle had devoured their bodies, but not their souls. Captain Miller, leading the rescue unit, barked orders. "Get medics here. Water, rations, fast. No one eats yet. They need treatment first." He looked around the camp and clenched his fists. "Not one of them dies on my watch." The state of the camp. Inside the barracks, soldiers found notebooks, letters, scraps of hope, messages to families that would never be sent. Each page was stained with rain and tears. The prisoners' leader, an old British officer, Colonel Smythe, limped forward. "Gentlemen," he croaked, "welcome to hell. You're late, but right on time." He smiled weakly and collapsed into their arms. Medics poured glucose into veins, wrapped bandages, and cleaned wounds. One soldier whispered, "Sir, they weigh less than my pack." The doctor replied softly, "Then carry them with care. They carried the war for us." The empty kitchen. The Americans entered the camp's kitchen, a blackened room, pots filled with mold, and sacks of weevils instead of rice. One cook muttered, "They starved them deliberately." Another replied, "Not anymore. Tonight, we feed them." The decision. Captain Miller stood at the gate, staring into the distance. He turned to his men. "We're going to cook. Not rations, real food. If we can't give them back their years, we'll give them one good meal." The soldiers searched nearby villages, finding chickens, vegetables, even coffee beans. Locals helped silently. Some had watched the prisoners suffer and cried as they handed over what little food they had. The pots began to boil. By sunset, the smell of cooking filled the air for the first time in years. Stew simmered in massive pots. The aroma traveled through the camp like a memory, one that awakened something long buried. The POWs gather. Word spread quickly. The Americans are cooking. Weak, trembling men began to crawl out of their barracks. Some could barely walk. Others leaned on each other. They followed the smell of life. Private Lewis lifted the lid of a pot and breathed in. "It smells like home," he said softly. For the prisoners, the sight of actual food felt unreal, a dream they feared would vanish if they blinked. The first meal. Rows of soldiers, rescuers and rescued, sat side by side on the ground. No ranks, no nations, just humans, waiting for a meal that meant more than survival. The first bite. A spoonful of stew. Silence. Then tears. One man whispered, "It's warm." Another murmured, "I remember this taste." Within seconds, quiet sobs filled the camp. The soldiers stood still, unsure whether to smile or cry. They had seen death, battle, and victory, but never this. Never men crying over soup. The sound of humanity. As the night deepened, laughter began to mix with tears. Stories returned. Names were remembered. Captain Miller looked around and whispered, "This meal, this changed everything." The night flickered with orange glow. Soldiers and prisoners sat around the fire, their faces half lit by dancing flames. The jungle hummed quietly, a world that had watched them suffer, now watching them heal. As steam rose from the pots, even the guards who once patrolled these fences seemed like ghosts of another world. No orders, no guns, just the quiet sound of spoons scraping tin bowls. A forgotten taste. Lieutenant Andrews held his bowl with trembling hands. He took one bite, closed his eyes, and whispered, "Beef stew. My wife made this before the war." A tear rolled down his cheek, cutting through the dust on his face. The young soldier's guilt. Private Lewis, who had helped cook, stood behind him. He said softly, "Sir, it's just stew." Andrews looked up and smiled weakly. "No, son, it's not just stew. It's hope in a bowl." The soldier's reflection. Captain Miller sat quietly apart, writing in his journal. He wrote, "They cried over food. Grown men, soldiers. But it wasn't weakness. It was freedom." The translator's bridge, a Japanese interpreter, captured weeks earlier but spared, stood nearby watching. He whispered to Miller, They are crying?" Miller nodded. The man bowed his head. "Maybe Japan will cry too, one day." The campfire stories. Around the fires, men began to speak, softly, like ghosts recalling their names. They told stories of homes, of wives, of children they hadn't seen since 1941. Feeding the weak. 2 American medics went hut to hut, feeding those too frail to walk. Each spoonful was a battle, shaking hands, feverish eyes, but determination to live. One man whispered, "Tell my wife, I ate well tonight." The colonel's blessing. Colonel Smythe, the British officer, stood shakily. "Gentlemen," he said, "for 3 years we were treated like animals, but tonight these men reminded us we're human again. For that, I thank you." He raised his tin cup of water as if it were champagne. The moment of laughter. Someone cracked a joke, something about canned rations being gourmet food now. Laughter broke out, awkward at first, then contagious. It was the sound of life returning to men who thought they'd never laugh again. The gift of bread. An American cook handed out freshly baked bread. The prisoners stared at it, soft, warm, real. They had forgotten what bread looked like. When they bit into it, some wept again, this time not from sorrow, but from memory. Brothers in silence. For hours no one spoke. The only sound was chewing, fire crackling, and the occasional whisper, "Thank you. God bless you. Don't stop." The small miracle. One of the sickest men, barely conscious, was fed a few spoonfuls of soup by a medic. The next morning, he opened his eyes for the first time in weeks and whispered, "It's over, isn't it?" The medic nodded. "Yes, sir. You made it." After the meal, Miller ordered paper and pencils distributed. "Write to your families," he said. "Tell them you lived." Weak hands wrote shaking lines to mothers, wives, children, words soaked with tears and relief. The shared cigarette. One American lit a cigarette and passed it around. 10 men shared it, not because they needed tobacco, but because sharing something again felt normal. The song. Someone hummed softly, an old wartime song. Others joined in. Soon, voices from different nations, British, American, Australian, sang together under the same night sky. The war had divided them by flags. The song united them by pain. The Japanese prisoner. Near the fence, a captured Japanese guard watched silently. He expected punishment, hatred. Instead, Miller walked up to him, handed him a bowl of the same stew, and said, "Eat." The man stared, confused, then bowed deeply and took a bite. Tears streamed down his face. The realization. One British soldier whispered to another, "They gave even the enemy a meal." The other replied, "That's how wars truly end." The midnight conversation. Late that night, Miller and Smythe sat by the fire. Smythe said, "You know, Captain, history will never write about this meal." Miller smiled faintly. "Maybe not, but the men who ate it, they'll never forget." The sky opens. Rain began to fall softly, turning the ashes of the fires into steam. No one ran for cover. They simply looked up and let the rain wash their faces. For once, it wasn't the rain of war. It was the rain of peace. Dawn confessions. As the first pale light crept through palm fronds, men who had been silent for years began to speak. Their voices were cracked from disuse, but the words came. Names, places, a litany of hunger and fear. The story of the road. A veteran whispered about the march. Hundreds forced to walk for days without water, collapsing into dust. He traced the route on the ground with his finger, as if the dirt could hold memory. The lost letters. A medic found a bundle of unsent letters in a torn tin. He read one aloud, the handwriting small, the words of a father saying he loved his child. A hush fell over the crowd. Even the guards bowed their heads. The survivor's tattoo. A thin man rolled up his sleeve to reveal faded ink, a name and a date. It was a mark he'd used to remember his identity when the world tried to erase it. Someone touched the letters like a prayer. The question they'd never asked. Children of the camp, boys who'd grown up behind wire, clustered near the cooks. "Why did you leave us?" they asked. The soldiers, none of whom had answers, only held their hands and promised they would try to make it right. The exchange of names. They traded names like coins. "I am Hero," one prisoner said. "I am Thomas," the soldier replied. They spoke slowly, delighted to learn the small thing human beings crave most: recognition. The old wound. A man who had been beaten spoke of the night a guard refused him water. He had thought that cruelty was the whole world. Now, he had to learn that the world contained small, fierce goodness too. The translator's burden. A captured translator, once mocked, now sat as a bridge between tongues. He told the Americans about the prisoners' birthdays, their mothers' names, their favorite seasons. The soldiers listened like students of a most sacred lesson. A soldier's shame. Private Lewis, who once enforced punishments, sat alone and wept. He confessed to a British veteran that he had watched a man die and done nothing. The veteran took his hand and said, "Then start by being human now." The healing touch. Medics taught prisoners simple bandage techniques. A hand with trembling fingers learned to tie a knot, to press a pad, to stop a flow. The act of caring became its own medicine. A mother's memory. An elderly prisoner described his wife's kimono. The pattern, the way she braided their daughter's hair. The men listened, soothed by the image of home, and it felt as if home were returning one thread at a time. The sound of names. They practiced saying each other's names over and over, as if repetition could stitch identity back to their bones. Andrews, Thomas, Hero, Sato. The sound of names filled the camp, and pushed back the silence. The small ceremony. Colonel Smythe ordained a small ceremony by the flagpole. Nothing official, just men gathered to mark their survival. They bowed their heads, not by rank, but by shared sorrow. A promise to remember. Miller made a promise aloud. We will report this. We will not let this be forgotten. He meant the cruelty, and he meant the meal. Both truths must live in the record of history. The little things. Return. The men found small joys, a clean shave, a dry shirt, a bar of soap. These were not luxuries, they were reclamations. Each tiny comfort repaired a piece of the self. The old man's song. A prisoner cleared his throat and began to sing a lullaby. One by one, weak as their lungs were, men joined. The melody floated through the barracks like a benediction. A child's question. A skinny boy asked why the Americans' eyes were blue. The soldier replied, "Because the sky is different where I'm from." The boy's answer was simple, "Then bring your sky to us." The soldier smiled, stunned by the purity of that request. The journal begins. A medic assigned to the camp began to write systematically. Names, conditions, dates. He did so not only for medical records, but to ensure that each person would be counted and returned to the world they had been taken from. The first mail. A scavenged radio was tuned, and radio announcements told families where POWs were registered. The word passed through villages like wildfire. Hope surged, a reckless, powerful thing. A child reunited. A man stumbled into camp, breathless, carrying a letter delivered by a passing convoy. It was a note from a daughter. She had been searching for her father. She found him sitting by the field. They embraced, and everyone watched, the camp breaking into smiles and soft weeping. The day for transport came. Trucks arrived to take the healthier prisoners to hospitals and repatriation points. The camp hummed with movement, packing, tying, promises whispered into weathered ears. The gift of clothes. Each man being moved received a clean uniform. It hung oddly on ragged shoulders, but when they looked in mirrors or muddy water, they saw someone else reflected. A man again, not a number. The soldier who stayed. Several soldiers refused transfer in order to stay the extra day. They carried stretchers, held hands, and refused to leave until every man was counted and tended. "I'll not leave you," whispered one, and meant it. The farewell meal. Before departure, they shared one more meal together, not as captor or captive, but as companions bound by the strangest of covenants, having nearly lost one another. The letter of forgiveness. A prisoner composed a shaky letter to a former guard, not to accuse, but to ask why. The guard, now a quiet figure among them, accepted the letter and then, for the first time, explained. His tears were an apology years late, but true. The helpers return. Local villagers who had smuggled food earlier reappeared with bundles for the leaving men. They bowed, not in shame, but in solidarity. One woman gave a child a ribbon, a symbol that small kindnesses endure. A soldier's name remembered. Lewis knelt down and carved names into a piece of wood, names of those who didn't make it. He carved slowly, as if the act itself honored the dead. When he finished, he handed the board to Colonel Smythe to take home. The train ride home. As trucks rolled toward trains, the POWs watched the landscape change, from scorched fields to greener pastures. Each mile was a small salvation. Men sang quietly in unison, words muddled but full of grace. The little boy's promise. A small POW who'd been too weak to leave promised the American boy who'd given him candy long ago. "When I grow, I will plant trees." The American nodded solemnly. "Plant them here. Plant them in your heart." The return of letters. Once at collection points, some letters were mailed, others handed personally to waiting families. Reunions unfolded in fields and train stations. Cries, laughter, the collapse of years into a single embrace. The memory that would not fade. Years later, veterans from both sides would gather and speak of that meal. They'd say the same thing in different words. That food fixed what guns broke. A shared bowl rebuilt trust. The photographer's frame. The photographer who'd captured the image of the child eating chocolate sent copies of the photograph to camps and charities. The image became a quiet emblem of healing, a reminder that mercy could be a weapon for peace. The children who grew up. Children raised on stories of that night grew up with a hunger that was not for food, but for understanding. They became aid workers, teachers, nurses, people determined to feed a broken world. A town rebuilt. The village where the POWs had been quartered, slowly rebuilt thanks to combined efforts, former enemies helping to mend walls and plant gardens. Where wire once cut the air, now vines climbed wooden frames. The old soldier's visit. Years later, an old Private Lewis returned to the field where the camp had been. He found an elder, once a prisoner, sitting beneath a tree. They embraced wordlessly. Both had changed, but both still remembered the night of stew. The museum piece. Colonel Smythe donated the tin bowl used that night to a small museum. Its plaque read simply, "One meal, one night, a nation of men remembered." Visitors stood quietly. Children pressed their hands to the glass. The promise to teach veterans told their grandchildren the story. A combat soldier can cook the best stew, they'd say, because it was made with hands that learned mercy. The next generation learned not to glorify only battle, but also the acts that healed. The widow's thanks. A widow of a soldier who'd perished wrote to the camp's commander, "You fed men who were starving of body and soul. For that, I thank you." The commander, now aged, kept that letter pinned to his wall. Belong peace. Decades on, peace endured, brittle, imperfect, but real. The men who had cried over bowls of stew had children who never saw war. They tasted cinnamon and sugar and taught their kids to share. The final image. On a museum wall, a single photograph hung. A child biting into a piece of candy, a soldier kneeling beside him. The caption read, "There are nights history forgets. Some nights we must remember." Fade to black. Narration closes softly. This meal changed everything, not because it filled their stomachs, but because it fed their souls.